This is fine. It's good to be with all of you today. So I'm Dan Shaw from the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources, and I'll be talking about best practices for preventing introduction of Palmer amaranth and native seed. We thought this would be a useful presentation because this is potentially a model that could be used for other pathways, because there are multiple pathways for the introduction of Palmer amaranth. So I'll be talking about the context of the problem with native seed, collaboration, the group that's been working together on these best practices, and then get into some of the key practices that we've been developing. When it comes to restoration in Minnesota, there's really a wide variety of plant communities that we restore across the state. Some of these are more intact communities, and we're using prescribed burning or other methods like invasive species removal for them. But when we're reconstructing communities, we really focus on seeding. Where we do the most seeding is with these prairie plant communities. So wet prairies, mesic prairies, dry prairies are all communities that we restore and really rely on seed vendors for obtaining seed for these projects. With different seed mixes in the state, we have state seed mixes. Currently we have about 27 standard seed mixes that we use for different projects. Private vendors have their individual seed mixes. There's also custom seed mixes that are developed for projects, and then some NRCS and Fish and Wildlife Service mixes are out there also. The problem of invasive species coming in on seed definitely isn't something that's new. We've seen more of this happen when there's wild collection or wild harvest of prairies, and it's easier to pick up thistles or some of that seed. But it does happen also in production fields where there's some seed that's collected as part of the harvest of production fields. There's just a lot going on in the process of using native seed with the harvesting, the transport of seed, the transactions between different vendors, and then the installation of seed. And so there's a lot happening there. There is room for things happening along the way. And Denise talked about some of the challenges we've had with some of the vendors over time too, not keeping good records and not following the best practices. And so those are all things that we're working on. So starting a few years ago, we started getting together as conservation partners talking about this issue. Palmer amaranth is a big risk for agriculture. It also poses a risk for conservation if landowners aren't willing to do conservation on their lands because they're concerned about Palmer amaranth or other weeds showing up. So it has raised a lot of concerns for the conservation community. So there's a pretty wide range of different partners started getting together. I see I don't have DNR on this list, so they should be on here as well. And so we started talking about what are the problems we're running into and what are the potential solutions that we can be looking at to try to figure out how we can start getting better on top of this problem. So getting into some of the key practices, ensuring seed quality through source requirements and seed quality specifications is one topic that we've been really focused on. Back by the agenda, probably most of you missed this because I put it out there a little bit later, we have this summary of best practices that we've been putting together. And these practices have now gone into our agency's native vegetation guidelines that are used for all of our projects. So it defines the practices for our projects. And also in those guidelines, we have information about source for seed for projects. And so we have this map that we use, and there's a sequence for obtaining seed for projects, because one of the things that we think is important is not going long distances for seed, trying to find seed more locally so we're not pulling seed in from central Iowa or other places where there may be issues with Palmer amaranth. Whenever possible, we want to be pulling seed in more locally for projects. There's genetic reasons for that as well, but definitely invasive species is one of the reasons that we are focused on these more local sources. So this is all summarized in that document on the left, which was recently updated. The current version isn't quite on our website yet because we're going through a website update, but it will be up there pretty soon. Let me know if you want me to send you a copy of the updated version. And these guidelines cover a variety of topics. So they include diversity, seed mixes, source, yellow tag seed, which is seed that has a verified source, typically to the county. So we do encourage that, and that is run through the Minnesota Crop Improvement Association in Minnesota, this yellow tag program. So we do encourage yellow tag seed because it does give us a verified source. Covers topics about use of cultivars and varieties, labeling, protecting existing communities. So there's a wide range of information that's included in this document, and it does set the policy for all of the projects that are being funded through our agency. You probably can't see this, but this is a seed specification. So this is another piece that we've been working on. It's in this document, so if you pick one of these up, it will be in the back. We think this is another important step as well, having specifications that can be used and create consistency with the use of seed. So this covers the source requirements. It covers topics about kind of what's expected with the transport of seed and those types of topics. We also, at the end, added a statement that if noxious weeds show up on a project, that it should be the responsibility of the installer to deal with those weeds. And that typically hasn't been part of contracts for restoration projects. We think that's another important piece. Another key practice, defining the roles of each group involved in seed production, sales, labeling, installation, and inspections. I don't think we've really done a good job of this in the past, really defining the roles of everybody that's involved through the whole process of restoration. And so this might be state agencies, in some cases, federal agencies, nonprofit organizations have different roles with starting with policy development, noxious weed and seed law coordination. So all these parts of the process of preventing the introduction, there's different responsibilities along the way. And so this is something that we're planning to do more and more outreach on, to make sure that people are understanding kind of who has a key role during each part of this process with prevention. And then also communicating roles and responsibilities. And so this is a part about the restoration process where we start with project bidding, where project managers have a role, seed vendors have a role. After acceptance of bids, project managers and landowners have a key role. So here we're defining roles again and trying to communicate who should be thinking about different aspects of prevention during each phase, from project bidding to after planting, where there needs to be monitoring involved. In many cases, there is a key role for landowners in this process, and so that's another piece that we've been trying to do more communication about, is communication to landowners about what they should be aware of during the bidding process, during acceptance of bids, all the way through to inspecting and looking for palm or amaranth after plantings happen. So there's a key role for landowners through that whole process. And so that is one of the key practices, is increasing awareness by landowners. Minnesota Department of Agriculture did a press release where they were raising awareness to landowners. This is a page that was copied by a county and then put up on a Soil and Water Conservation District website. And so we're seeing the press release show up in multiple places after it was released, raising awareness about what landowners should be thinking about as they're purchasing native seed. And so I think that's starting to happen, that there's more awareness out there. Natural Resource Conservation Service also created a fact sheet based on this press release, and it has Bowser and MDA logos on that fact sheet. So we've been working together to try to get more awareness to landowners on this topic. Denise talked about the MDA facilities and field inspections that's happening. I think this has been a really important piece of the puzzle because having more of this happen really has raised awareness with all the vendors out there. And so if some of them weren't really following all the rules, they're doing it now because they know that there's a lot of work happening to inspect and make sure that the records are in order, that there isn't anything happening that shouldn't be happening out there with seed. So we see this as a really big improvement that's happened over the last couple of years. And so it's been really good to work with MDA on this. And so this has made a big difference. Monitoring projects after installation, this is one other piece that for anybody working on our projects, we're really trying to raise awareness about this, that there needs to be inspections and monitoring happening on projects to make sure that Palmer Amaranth isn't getting missed on these sites. I think Tony had mentioned that, long-term, Palmer Amaranth isn't a big risk to these conservation plantings because as the natives come in, the Palmer Amaranth will fade away, like annual and biennial weeds tend to do in these plantings. But the risk is that it's going to establish and then move into an agricultural field. So that's where these first couple years, first 2 to 3 years is really important, where the native vegetation is establishing to make sure that Palmer Amaranth isn't there and potentially spreading. Documentation, something Denise talked about. So one other key piece of the process, Denise had talked a lot about documentation with vendors and making sure their records are in order. But also during the restoration process, we're wanting to make sure there's documentation happening about what was seeded and where it was seeded on projects. And this becomes important as they go out and do inspections and try to figure out what actually happened on this site. I think restoration as a whole hasn't always done a good job of keeping records of what had happened with a restoration project. And overall, there is an effort with restoration to try to improve that, get more documentation of what actually has happened on projects, because a lot of things change through the course of a project. Things are pretty dynamic. If seed isn't available, there will be substitutions. Weather conditions can change a restoration project. So a lot of things can change the schedule and change what actually happens on the ground. And so this is one other piece, trying to have that well documented about what was seeded, where it was seeded. In a lot of cases, this information needs to come from the installer themselves about where they seeded different mixes on a site. And Denise also talked about seed testing and consistency as one other key practice, that native seed, we have about 2,400 species of natives in the state. And the testing of all of them is a little bit different, and so the consistency isn't always there with how seed is being tested. And so that's something that Denise is working on with consistency between these labs. So next steps, we'll be conducting more outreach. So we've been developing these best practices. We have this information that's going into our native vegetation guidelines. We really need to make sure that people working on projects understand the content of this information, trying to really do more outreach on this topic. And so it's going to be a lot more communication moving ahead. And then I think with any of these types of documents and best practices, they'll need to continue evolving in the future. I don't think we totally have it figured out yet, what all the solutions are. I think we have a good start. So that'll be key moving ahead to trying to adapt this and keep making changes as we move ahead. All right, thank you.